Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this, the first of BDB Pitmans webinars relating to waterside property development. My name is Sue Macpherson and I'm a consultant with the firm. We have offices in Southampton, Cambridge, London and Reading, and field a number of real estate solicitors who have experience in dealing with this type of development. You'll meet later my colleagues John Newton from the Southampton office and Katy Klingopulos from the Cambridge office. We work with also parliamentary agents and planning colleagues in our other offices as well. I personally have been advising clients since the 1980s in relation to waterside developments in ports and marinas, and have spent 16 years in-house at two marina companies in the south. I worked out that I've advised in relation to at least 40 waterside sites, both in the UK and abroad. You'll see on the slide a programme for this afternoon's session. We have very interesting speakers, which include a planning consultant, a director of regeneration at a local authority, and two private developers who are each going to give you their unique insights into issues which affected the developments which they're involved in. Before we start, just some guidance, some housekeeping. If you have any technical issues, can you please type a message in the chat box on your screen? You'll see it along the bottom of the screen and someone will try to help you. If you have any questions for the speakers as we go through, could you please type these in the question box, and I'll raise the questions with the speakers in the final panel question time. We have a lot to get through, so we want to do the presentations first, as we've only got an hour. So first of all, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our first speaker and fellow countryman, Gavin Hall. He's the director and head of Savills Southampton planning team. Excuse me. He has extensive experience in bringing forward the planning for waterfront developments, such as the regeneration of Ocean Village in Southampton through the Harbour Hotel, and wider developments at that site to enhance the waterfront. He has also overseen the planning of Centenary Quay in Woolston, Southampton, that's since 2009, and more recently the proposed new red funnel car ferry terminal at East Cowes on the Isle of Wight. He's the lead consultant advising Portsmouth City Council on the Tipna West Regeneration Programme, which is being promoted through their city deal. This will deliver a mixed-use development with a marine and maritime hub and a centre of excellence for the Solent. His talk today is entitled Turning Water into Wine. So Gavin, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Sue. Good morning, everyone. As Sue's mentioned, I'm going to speak today about issues affecting waterfront development. How do you capture value from the water? Can we turn water into wine? Waterfront development provides a huge range of opportunities. For industry and tourism, cities are often built upon mouths of major estuaries where some of the largest economies arise. Property gains value from its proximity to water. Examples here, a mezzanine flat close to the waterfront, a Manhattan-style apartment dockside. What is the secret, and how do we capture this value for the development industry? How do we turn water into wine? Norway, a country where development occurs within and at one with its environment. The Trøndelag region of Norway is at the very heart of the country, with the veins stretching out in every direction. And here is Trondheim, one of the most beautiful places within that region and on the earth, built on the waterfront, but based upon its history, focusing on culture to grasp value, but remembering at all times nature, grasping its natural environment. What is the secret? How do we capture this value? How do we grasp the opportunities and mitigate the issues or constraints without losing the very essence of what makes waterfront valuable? How do we turn water into wine without destroying the vineyard or the fundamental elements of the waterfront, its history, its nature, its culture, and not forgetting development and the economy? I'm going to take an unusual approach this morning, looking at the whole ecosystem approach to waterfront and waterfront development. I'm going to look at its history, nature, culture, as well as development and the economy? How do we grasp the opportunities, mitigate the issues or constraints without losing the very essence of what makes waterfront valuable? Not everywhere is as pristine as Trondheim, or at least not now, but it could well have been before humans intervened. Waterfront and its uses changed temporarily, within a day and over years. I remember back to my geography lessons back in Belfast. We all learned that settlements often grew up around water and rivers. Belfast, in fact, was founded on the Farset River. Shown here, it doesn't look much of an attraction, does it? But this is how I and Sue and countless of my generation will remember the Belfast waterfront of our childhood. How do we garner the benefits without destroying it like this? It can be done. Rather than turning its back on its waterfront, Belfast has now turned its attention back to its waterfront, building on its heritage and embracing at the same time nature, enabling fish to swim and breed again in the river. This public art was installed once the fish started breeding back in the river Farset, in the lagoon. But if we're going to have places like this and cruise ports and a whole cruise industry, are we destined to have places like this? How do we avoid impacting on the waterfront through development, and how do we capture what's best? How do we grasp the opportunities and mitigate the issues or constraints? So, history. Let's start there. Our waterfront has long been used to add value. This is Ocean Village in Southampton. Maybe not as glamorous as Trondheim or as pristine, but maybe more on a par with Belfast. But it has nevertheless generated wealth and value, and continues to, and it is in the natural ecosystem where Atlantic salmon return every winter to breed along the River Itchen. There was probably little concern at the natural ecosystem in the past. Here we see Ocean Village in the olden days, wealth generator for Southampton for years gone by. But imagine the impacts that that has since created. Throughout my career at Savills, I've been fortunate enough to work on many schemes within waterfront environments, including East Cowes on the Isle of Wight, as mentioned, but also here in Ocean Village. There we have secured listed dockwall consents. We have discovered the old inner quay, where we can see currently the ramps and the marshalling yards and car processing centres, and once where water stood. However, that inner dock that you can see here was filled in, perhaps to deliver more income. Just like the Western Docks in Southampton, West Quay, Royal Pier, the quays, IKEA are all now on this land that once was water. But do we lose by doing this? Have we just pushed our waterfront further away? Are we becoming disconnected from the water? Here, it is very clear how a potential development to reconnect with the water could be pushing it away. Is waterfront development actually at conflict with itself? Does the development create but destroy the value at the very same time? Returning to Ocean Village, I would argue not, if done sympathetically. The new hotel in Ocean Village has captured the waterfront. It has brought people back and allowed investment that has ensured Southampton's waterfront is once again a development to be proud of. It has also protected that water. The Atlantic salmon, for example, are protected through planning conditions and requirements that were installed with these planning permissions. And this is just one example. Across the river, we see a further example. Vosper Thornycroft, heavy boat building, heavy industry. Cleared, cleaned, and remediated, but also reinvigorated. Bringing the waterfront back, enhancing care for this very important natural resource, and bringing people back to the water's edge in a safe manner at one with nature was an important part of this scheme. Here you see the paths are pushed back to ensure recreational disturbance is taken account of. Dog walkers can still walk and engage with the river, but at a safe distance from the wildlife enhanced river terraces that you can see in the foreground. So returning to the whole ecosystem approach of goals, land, water, value, economy, I'm going to briefly touch on a scheme where the very nature of water is vital. Tipna in Portsmouth. This is a proposal that may require significant land reclamation. Is that creating wine from water, or is that too simplistic an approach? Many might see this image as deceptive, that we are disengaging with the water, as I mentioned previously, and that the value attached to it in terms of its habitats and presence is being disregarded. However, if done properly, these very elements will be protected and enhanced. Indeed, planning and the rules that we all know too well ensures that disregard cannot be had for such a natural asset. But can it be more proactively grasped for all of our benefit? Tipna, of which a concept is shown here, is rooted in the following principles. Unlocking critical employment sites for the marine and maritime industry. Providing homes for people and the growing Portsmouth workforce to live in, ideally close to their work. Providing access for them to engage with the waterfront and to use the water. The two of the key principles behind the development that will be secured are a focus on nature and health and well-being. There is a major growing body of evidence all about the health benefits that water brings, in particular with regard to mental health benefits of being close to water. Developing an integrated blue-green approach is developing an integrated ecosystem of life. In doing so, at Tipna and in other waterfront developments that I work on, we clearly look at all of the technical constraints and legislative requirements that such a proposal would bring. But we are doing that in order to harness the value from the water, provide the marine and maritime employment opportunities that are so important for Solent and for which the area is renowned, but not at the loss of nature. Those opportunities only exist due to the water. We cannot destroy the water. In fact, it is only due to the water that we have them. And the water can give us so much more. The water will bring us blue health. It will enrich the lives of those who live and work there and our natural environment. So I return to our original question. How can we turn water into wine? How do you capture value from water? It is understanding the whole ecosystem approach that I propose that the very value of the water needs to be harnessed in the development, protected in and by the development, and used in the design to provide sustenance of the very nature of why we want to develop in waterfront areas in the first place. We must understand the issues affecting waterfront development and positively work with them, the constraints and the opportunities. In that way, I look to be involved in schemes that are not a developer's charter, ignoring nature, but are truly responsible approaches, as with Tipna, Trondheim, and the Trøndelag. In fact, if you Google search Trøndelag, it is Norway's quiet achiever. It combines nature, culture, and history. And within the middle of it is Trondheim, where we started, and where we hope one day to get back to. We hope to develop value from our waterfront, but ensuring that in turn that it becomes more valuable in economic, but also health, social, cultural, and natural capital terms, using the whole ecosystem approach. We have done it before, as in Belfast, and we can do it over and over again, but it needs a wide appreciation of why we do it, that we need to pass on a better place when we have done it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gavin, for that excellent presentation. You've certainly given us a very fresh perspective on the way in which waterfront developments can evolve in keeping with their surroundings. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce you to my colleague, John Newton. John was a partner in our Southampton office for 30 years and is now a consultant with the firm. He specialises in commercial property with a particular emphasis on sites which are on, over and next to the water. His work has a particular focus on the South Coast and the Isle of Wight. John, over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Mr. Pete Bradshaw. Pete is the CEO of Premier Marina Group, a role that he's held for the last 12 years. As the owner and operator of 9 marinas across the South Coast, Premier is faced with the regeneration challenge that affects most of the UK's marinas. This, of course, means engaging in the planning system, as we shall hear. Current projects in the pipeline include the complete redevelopment of Nozzle Duct in East Devon and the Swanwick Marina closer to home, both of which provide the background for today's discussion, which I'm sure attendees will find interesting.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon and welcome. Firstly, I'm no planning expert, nor am I a development expert, but as John said, as the CEO of a marina operator and owner, I am faced with the challenge of regenerating the land and water elements of our business, most of which was built over 40 years ago. So to give my thoughts some context, I thought I would relate them to a specific development, one that has a bit of everything and more than its fair share of issues. So first slide shows a site called Nozzle Duct on the River Dart in Devon. It's an amazing site, stunning location, amazing views both up and down the river. It's on the sunny side of the river, as opposed to Dartmouth, which seems to sit in shade in the afternoon. But it's a very typical brownfield waterside site. It was a former shipyard. It migrated to some leisure use during the 1980s, but by the time we acquired the site in 2016, it was largely derelict and well beyond the end of its useful life. So we acquired this site with the intention of redeveloping it, and we started working on our planning application straight away. It took us until June 2017 before we were able to submit, and it wasn't until August 2018 before the planning application was approved. And whilst we were able to do some bits on site, it wasn't until late 2019 before we could really get going. So I think by sharing some war stories on why all of this took so long, I might be able to paint a picture of some of the challenges that waterside developments bring, and maybe some of the challenges that are slightly unique to them. So clearly getting planning consent is always a challenge, and that is a fairly big hurdle to get over. And waterside sites have some characteristics that make this more difficult than for typical brownfield sites. Firstly, we have different regulators above and below the high water mark. We have local planning authority for the land side and the marine management organisation for anything below the mean high water mark. And developments across both can get quite complicated, and whatever you do, don't assume that both regulators will have the same answer to the same question. There is supposed to be a coastal concord out that's meant to make all of this a lot easier. It was one of the government's efforts at deregulation and getting rid of red tape, but I have to say I'm not sure it's particularly changed very much. Typically, these sites also have environmental and ecological designations that are unique to waterside sites. The most significant of these that we come up with, face time and time again, is intertidal habitat. Our plans resulted in a relatively small loss of intertidal habitat, and as this is the UK's fastest disappearing habitat, it gets a huge amount of interest from the Environment Agency and from Natural England. They will typically take a very, very long time to think about this, as they did in the case of Nozzle Duct. And again, don't assume both will want the same solution to the same problem. In our case, one party wanted a payment to provide for future intertidal habitat creation. The other wanted us to find a perfect offset solution, so create an equal amount of intertidal habitat to that we were losing. By some miracle, we managed to find an offset solution. That though didn't satisfy the other party, who still wanted a payment of an amount of money. So we did end up both paying and providing perfect offset to satisfy both statutory consultees on the same issue. That kind of thing isn't unusual, and whilst it feels wrong, you don't really have any choice. You just have to suck it up and deal with it. I think the second issue that's quite specific to waterside, so not specific but common on waterside sites, is contamination risk. You will always have to do lots of work to determine the extent of the issue. In our case, this site didn't appear to be terribly contaminated or blighted by its past, but I'll come on to mention that some of the surprises only actually really come when you start putting a digger bucket in the ground. Not specific to Waterfront, but we had a very interesting challenge with bats on this site at Nos. I was delighted to find that the site was designated as a protected strategic flyway associated with the greater horseshoe bat, and the site itself was also noted as a key feeding ground and foraging zone for bats. So however expensive and time consuming you think that is, you can double it. And the issue isn't really the money with this, it's more the fact that a lot of the surveys that have to be undertaken are seasonal, and if you miss a window, you can lose 12 months very, very, very quickly. If you are regenerating, and a lot of marine waterside sites have a history, heritage will be a factor. An interested local heritage officer combined with a scheduled ancient monument on site can make for some interesting debate. I always thought that scheduled ancient monuments were things like Stonehenge, but you'll be surprised at how many things are on the list of scheduled ancient monuments. For us, it was a set of launch pads for D-Day landing craft, which were visible for a very limited time each day due to tide. But again, very expensive, very time consuming to deal with. Albeit it does add some personality to the site that you wouldn't have if that wasn't there. One of my favourites is local rumours and gossip. Every local is an expert. We had locals who knew a lot about unexploded bombs and pipe mines across the road. And I'm sure you can imagine that once those get mentioned, you're into a lot of work just to try and dispel the rumours. We ended up actually having to engage the services of an eminent historian who was able to identify every single German plane that flew up the river during the Second World War and every single bomb that was dropped, and was then able to account for every single bomb so that we were sure that we didn't have any unexploded bombs on site. Second image, you can get there, and this is an old-fashioned version of a CGI done by someone with some colouring pens. Which illustrates the master plan for that same site. So it comprises a mix of uses, including a marina, a boatyard, a dry stack, commercial property for tenants providing complementary services, car parking and hotel, and up to 130 residential units. Getting working on site, that took us over a year from the point at which we got planning condition. And the big challenge there is clearing pre-commencement conditions. And I think we still have an issue with over-conditioned planning consents, although the government is encouraging local planning authorities not to over-condition consents. They sort of can't help themselves. And I think this is more the case with waterside developments, where there are more factors that cause them concern. This is a bit of a double whammy, because not only do you have a long list of conditions to try and clear, but it is almost certainly the case that the local planning authority will not have the resource to clear their own conditions. And I would say of all the issues we faced, this was our most problematic. You know, we had a very supportive planning authority who was very keen to see the development happen, but they simply didn't have the resource to help us make it happen in a timely manner. Third slide, this was taken about 2 weeks ago now, and shows that we are actually on site and we are developing. And we have multiple phases of development underway. This is when you truly find out whether your contamination surveys were very accurate or not, and if the site is reclaimed land, and a huge amount of waterside development is on reclaimed land, you are bound to have some surprises. So whilst this site was pretty clean, we still found piles of old blue asbestos that all have to be hand-picked and cleared very carefully. We found all sorts of interesting artifacts or uninteresting artifacts from the past that need to be disposed of in special ways and can't just be put into a skip. And it all adds to the cost and the timeline of getting your development done. The other issue you will have is, depending on how heavily conditioned the consent is, you've got ongoing condition compliance to manage. And it amused me no end when we had a single digger driver working on site who was being watched by an ecologist and an archaeologist. So we actually had more people on site making sure we were complying with conditions than we actually had doing the work. So is it all worth it? For us, yes, it is. Waterside sites are amazingly special, and every time I visit any of our sites, but particularly Nozzle Duct, I'm just amazed at how beautiful they are. People do want to be by the water. I think we take great pride in regenerating and giving a new life to waterside sites and making them fit for the next 30 or 40 years. If you do own a waterside site, my one suggestion is that you monitor the planning and environmental position affecting your site very closely. Make sure you make representations to protect your position. Local planning authorities, but particularly Natural England and Environment Agency, are very capable of moving the goalposts and changing the designation of your land. And if you're not making representations, it can be a bit of a surprise when you come to put a planning application in to find that you can't do what you would like to do. And that's it from me. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Pete. Very informative talk. Very exciting site down there in Devon. I would now like to introduce you to Katy, who is Legal Director at BDB Pitmans Cambridge office. Katy specialises in commercial property and has a particular expertise in residential development. Katy has worked with numerous developers on residential and mixed-use sites in London, and many of those have been on the waterfront.
Thank you, John. So next up is David Skelton, Sales and Marketing Director, and Matt Smith, Senior Project Manager at Frasers Property UK. Frasers Property is an international developer and operator of commercial and residential property, operating in Singapore, Australia, Southeast Asia, China, and Europe. As the last phase comes to completion, David and Matt will talk about their experience developing Riverside Quarter, a residential scheme of over 750 units in Wandsworth, and the particular challenges of developing next to the Thames. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Katy. What we wanted to do was ask Melissa to click through. Melissa, if I just point a finger in the air, is that sufficient for you to be able to take the slides through? Okay, well, first of all, where we are. Wandsworth Riverside Quarter is on the banks of the Thames, overlooking Hurlingham Park on the other side of the river, giving us a perfect green outlook in Zone 2 of London. But what it used to look like was this. It was a former Shell oil depot with deliveries to those two chunky jetties sticking out into the Thames. It was a 10-acre site that needed complete remediation, which Matt will talk about. But more importantly, those jetties were going to be part and parcel of the story as we went through developing the site. What we acquired was a planning permission that had been engineered by Persimmon with Wandsworth for over 400 residential units. And there's a small byline at the bottom was to create a 16 residential berth marina. We were concentrating on the opportunities on dry land and not realizing quite how many obstacles there were to developing actually on the river. And these were solid concrete reinforced structures for the tankers coming down the river to offload into the Shell oil depot. These were not going to be in any way useful for residential or for any sort of mooring activity. But what they had become during the time when they weren't being used by Shell was what were called valuable roosting spots for bird life. And so in the bottom picture, it's interesting, actually, we had to create bird barges further down the river next to Onesworth Park. And somebody earlier mentioned about World War II. These saw service crossing the Rhine, apparently, but they were relatively cheap. And The only problem was that we had to fix them to the river, and they are grounding on the riverbed every day and gradually scraping holes in the bottom, so we're periodically having to repair them. But the jetties themselves started to have to be removed, and that was well over £2 million exercise as part and parcel of the overall redevelopment of the site. And over time, this was for 2001, over time, the original planning permission of 420 odd units, we've enhanced, improved, and created a true residential quarter of over 700 residential units, including 197 affordable, and also over 39 commercial units within the development, which provide employment to well over 150 people, but also keep the activity level on site through the whole of the day. And of course, this site as an oil terminus had been shut off from the rest of the world for, what, over 50 years, 60 years? So we were tasked with recreating the river walk all the way along from Onesworth Park, which would be to the left, all the way down to the River Wandel, and carrying on eventually up to Battersea Park with a small detour around the Battersea Waste Station. And I'll now hand you over to Matt to show what has been created over that time.
Yeah, so you can see the original planning permission, it was a persimmon site, and there was an original planning permission in 2001, and that was acquired by Frasers, and we built out, obviously our colleagues built out the front four buildings, and they were obviously delivered between the 2003 to 2007. And then in 2008, following the financial crisis in 2008, we took the scheme back into planning to get planning permission for what you will see the four taller buildings towards the back. And then in 2016, we went back into planning one more time to produce the final building, which we've just completed earlier this year, and obviously COVID issues notwithstanding. And I guess while there was a lot of activity down on the riverfront for the first planning permission, first phases, there was this legacy of Section 106 agreements with the council, with the Environment Agency. I think they were touched upon in the previous speaker, where, you know, although we've got a new planning permission, we obviously have to keep those legacy agreements and add to them rather than water them down. And obviously, indeed, they're agreed now with more up-to-date standards as obviously things are progressing as we go through the years. So back to this final phase, obviously we returned back to the waterfront, really, and really sensitive location. So it's at the confluence of the River Wandel that you can see on the left and the River Thames, and obviously, again, similar themes to the other speakers. This is a really important site in terms of not only aquatic birds, but also these spawning salmonids and these small fish, that this is a key position in their life cycle. And obviously we've worked over the years with ZSL, for instance, to allow them to have monitoring stations around there so they can track the various fish going up the river and back down again. And so hopefully we'll get some results back from there. But if we just move on to the next slide, you can see some of the key issues really, and we'll flip back onto the moorings and the pier extension later, but you can see there was already an existing flood defence across the Thames and then working around the River Wandel. And one of the key planning permission or key requirements was this creating these in-style terraces. And again, this was to essentially try and protect that confluence and give back sort of this important ecological space back to not only the spawning fish, but also the invertebrate life and all the other associated benefits. So we carried that out first thing in 2001, and we moved the flood defences there from the outer line, and we cut those back, and we then installed a totally new flood defence line, which then, when we got to 2016-17, we then had to obviously upgrade that as part of the works in agreement with the EA. And obviously, just for this final phase alone, there was, I think, top of my head, 13 separate licenses. So that's not only with, obviously, Wandsworth in terms of the planning permission, but you also have, obviously, the EA. You obviously have agreements with the PLA, Ports Authority London, things like that. So much agreement, and I guess one of the challenges there is, and the reason we split it into so many different licenses was because obviously we are still going through the technical design and the detailed design. Some of those things you need for those licenses will only become apparent as you get into the very detailed design when you're actually on site. So if we just flick on to the next slide. Yeah, so this is the Intel terraces back in 2008, and then one of the other, obviously we're working on this alongside many other big projects in London. Obviously the key one is Thames Tideway, and actually the connection, well, I was calling the Frogmore connection, but they've now changed the terminology, I think, to the Denmore Street, but essentially that runs all the way down the Wandel, 25 metres down. And obviously we had a load of monitoring stations on our river wall as well to make sure we weren't getting any settlement, any issues as they were tunnelling under us. And one of the issues, you can see the weir there. So for a long time, you know, that was put in, as I understand it, around 2001, and for a long time it wasn't quite working, I think, as intended. And behind that weir, there was a lot of contamination, a lot of silting up, and as one of the sort of obligations from the Thames Tideway project, they actually removed that weir, and they've now dredged and decontaminate a massive part of that Wandel, and we're starting to see that obviously come through. But I guess, unfortunately, part of that, and potentially connected, potentially not, we had an issue where you see the sheet pile wall that we'd cut back actually burst open, and I think that's on the next slide, Melissa. Oh, sorry, actually, this is just this is the inside terraces when they were first planted, obviously with that diverse species and planting developed with the ecologists and the landscape architects, obviously be this habitat for those invertebrate species. And actually, we were on a tour with the EA. I think it is actually well regarded. It's actually one of these sort of terrace areas that actually achieves, I think, or mostly achieves what it was set out to do. Sorry, next slide. So I'm just conscious of time as well. So just very quickly, you can see this is actually, as we're excavating down the two-storey basement, this is directly adjacent to those upgraded that upgraded flood defence system. And obviously part of the complexity was removing a set of anchor blocks that tie in the cantilever of that flood defence system, digging down directly next to it, and then tying it all back in together. And obviously there's a lot of work with our marine engineers, Beckett Rankin, obviously worked for many years down there, and Tim Beckett and the team down there, and obviously our structural engineers, Robert Bird, to not only agree this sequencing with the EA and with all the parties, and also ensure it's buildable, and obviously to the programme we're running to. Sorry, one sec. And there you can see we actually commenced this phase back in 2016. We completed it earlier this year. You know, you can see it is a true Riverside development. It's, again, the actual position of the block was subject to a lot of negotiation with the EA because it's within that flood defence zone, and we had to ensure that obviously that access is there, that if Frasers disappear for whatever reason, not that I'm suggesting we will do, but the EA can step in and take over and repair those flood defences that have obviously now been upgraded to the, you know, the 2100 baseline. So next slide, Melissa. Also coupled with this, this part, it coincided with when the Thames Clippers upgraded their fleet essentially to these much bigger boats. And because of that, that was obviously starting to damage the riverbed then, interact with a lot of the residents, and we actually upgraded the pier extension. We pushed it further out into the Thames, and again, that was an agreement with the Wandsworth in terms of planning, but also obviously the Environment Agency, Port of London Authority, and all these agreements again to be able to do that. And we ploughed another £1 million into that. And I think I'm just going to pass back to David to pick up on the pier. Sorry, David. Sorry.
Right, back to the more recent world. And after I mentioned how much the replacement of the original concrete jetties was well over £2 million, and we had to also agree a license with a PLA for the marina works. The PLA sometimes sort of works in mysterious ways. Effectively, it creates a 60-year license, which I think was the first long license that had been offered out on the river for very many decades. So we were a forerunner of what became a renegotiation up the whole length of the Thames for residential moorings. The 16 moorings residential moorings that had been part of the planning application and approval had been reduced in the process to 12 residential moorings and 4 visitor moorings on the outer flank. The problem is that there really weren't any visitors. The Thames is tidal. You need to have vessels that can bottom out, and perhaps you can see the sheer scale of some of those river homes that are now being described rather than river boats. Some of them are concrete constructions of around 3,000 square feet, so substantial homes. But even as substantial as that, the Clippers service that we agreed in 2003 with Transport for London at a time when Boris Johnson was encouraging the first steps into West River commuter traffic, TfL could afford to bring together all of the pier owners to the west and co-join to have a proper service that tied in with the TfL overall picture for London. And the only problem now is that TfL has a very significant black hole in its budget. We've extended the pier out to provide more services, but Thames Clippers, particularly this year, with COVID, are unable to support things. Melissa, could I go into the next slide? This is where the damage occurred on the Wandel that Matt was alluding to earlier. I'm conscious that we're well over time, so if we can go over again, next. That's the Wandsworth Riverside Port pier, and next. And this is what it's starting to look like. There are 40,000 passenger journeys in 2019. That's fallen to less than 4,000 in the last 6 months, which is proving to be a problem that we can all hope that we'll recover from once we have all got protection from C19 and able to transport ourselves on commuter links back to the office again. And I think with a picture of the Uber boat by Thames Clippers, which is a service that's being offered, that's the end of our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David and Matt. That was very interesting and really quite useful to understand some of the differences that come with developing by the waterside. So without further ado, I will pass over to my colleague John Newton.
Good afternoon again. I would like to introduce our final speaker this afternoon, Chris Ashman. Chris is leading the implementation of a 10-year programme of regeneration on the Isle of Wight for the council. He is also responsible for the island's COVID-19 recovery plan. Chris tells me, as a proud Welshman, he made a guest appearance in the feature film of the Wales football team, the Euro 2016 success. A self-confessed failed sailor to date, he hopes in his spare time on the island to finally acquire his sea legs. The marine sector heritage is part of the island's DNA, and a sustainable, viable future for this sector is a key objective for future regeneration plans, as Chris will explain. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Much appreciated, and thank you to everyone for inviting me along to speak. It's been really helpful actually listening to the other speakers, and I'm so tempted to reflect on some of the points they've made and the synergies and issues linked to our presentation here. But the most significant contribution I think I can make today is giving a local authority perspective. We heard them referenced in their statutory responsibilities, and colleagues will, I'm sure, have come across authorities who have increasingly been under pressure due to their financial challenges to take more of an active role in their whole place leadership approach. They are designated by legislation as place leaders, and bringing forward the economic, social and environmental sustainability of those communities is a key function for local government. So I just wanted to reflect on some of the points really in relation to the capacity of those organisations that our colleague from the DART reflected on, and the council investing in the formation of a regeneration function to actually address some of the structural challenges it faces. So if I could move on to the next slide, thank you. The title of my presentation really is centred upon the marine sector, and the island, as you would expect as an island, has a very strong heritage in that regard. And in terms of bringing forward a regeneration programme, building on what you've got and what makes you strong is a really important facet of that. So we've sought to bring that agenda forward as a key part of the regeneration programme. Next slide, please. So in context of our agenda, I think I just wanted to give you an overview of the overall process, and if we could click on the rest of the bullet points just to give some of those key areas of the programme. And I think what I'm hoping you'll recognise from the other speakers is some of the similarities here. We do have a significant opportunity on the island. We'll be one of the third place in the world actually to have full fibre connectivity across the whole of the local authority by the end of 2021. We have that strong marine and composites cluster sector potential, and crucially, we want to use our natural assets, which Gavin was referring to, equally as important on the island. We have and were designated as a national biosphere, international biosphere by UNESCO 2 years ago. So we're very anxious to bring forward sensitive proposals that obviously build economic prosperity but balance our environmental offer as well. The next slide, please. The island, as you probably would have expected or been aware of, has had quite a lot of high profile in recent weeks. We remain the lowest numbers in terms of infection rates in the UK on COVID, and also we also piloted the NHS app for COVID detection back in the spring, and some may have already also noticed the appearance of a monolith on the southern part of the island over the last few days. So the island is very keen to make the most of this newfound notoriety, really, as one of the safest places in the UK, and also offering some of the best quality of life. So what we have in this slide is an overview of the overall programme of regeneration that we're bringing forward, and I've been focusing really on the square at the top of the island there, around the Medina Valley and the entry points around the ferry terminals into the island, and the River Medina that runs right through the centre of the island to Newport. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start with Newport Harbour. Really, we've brought forward a comprehensive master plan for the regeneration, probably of the only townside waterfront site on the south coast that hasn't had any attention brought to it. That master plan was approved by our cabinet last month with a 3-phase approach to bring forward mixed-use development. But actually, in that central cluster in the north of the island, near Cowes, we have a range of waterfront development sites that are in need of some TLC, to be frank. And what we have there in the bottom left is a private sector development, which has permission for 300 residential units and 100,000 square foot marine employment zone, led by the private sector. The image in the top part of the slide is taken forward by our Cowes Harbour Commission as a waterfront small industrial site at Kingston Wharf. And then bottom right is the Columbine area, and formerly known as Venture Keys, where the council itself recently acquired, with John's support actually, the ownership of these sites from Homes England. And again, we did that with the primary intention of protecting the boat manufacturing tenant that's based in that Union Jack building there in the bottom right. And just a quick reflection, really, just the last presentation for Frasers there, and the Thames Clippers. The White Shipyard that's based in that building actually manufactures the Thames Clippers, which is quite a nice note to link the different presentations. So bringing forward each of these sites has its own specific challenges, and what we sought to do is bring forward the evidence base to government to help us with that challenge. Next slide, please. So in summary, really, the sector is really important culturally to the island. We recognise that there's quite a significant scope of micro firms within the sector, and moving on to the next slide if we can, in terms of the different breakdown of those sectors. Around particularly the workboat manufacturing sector, leisure clearly with Cowes and its international reputation as being key. We have a very strong, diverse mix of businesses there that we want to grow and sustain, as well as the larger boat manufacturing sector, all within the balanced environment of the Medina Valley, as I touched on earlier on. And next slide, please. Just wanted to obviously highlight those opportunities in the context of the island, and recognise our scale and of our challenge really in bringing forward the sites. We really look forward to the development of the Freeport proposal, with Solent obviously and Southampton as a key partner there, and we look forward to seeing that bring forward opportunities for the island itself. But actually we have become quite self-reliant on the Isle of Wight, and as a result we're seeking government support to bring forward some of those key sites, particularly in terms of their infrastructure and viability challenges. So I'll stop there and thank you for the opportunity to bring you up to speed on what's happening on the island. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much indeed for giving us the Isle of Wight perspective on waterfront and marine, not to be overlooked in any appraisal of waterfront development generally. I will now hand back without more ado to our chairman.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for all our speakers for sharing their experiences and their views with us today. We now have probably about 10 minutes, 50 minutes for questions. We'll probably go over, but that's not a problem. I see that we've got a question, which I'm just going to see if I can open it. Right. The question comes from Gary Cutts of Turner and Townsend. It's for Gavin. I see you have typed an answer. Do you want to take the question now?
Yeah, do you want to run through that?
Shall I read the question? Gary asks, in your opinion, does Norway have a more rigorous planning framework to encourage better waterside development than the UK? And if so, how could the UK regulations change to encourage better project outcomes?
Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Gary, as well. It's really interesting, actually, because Norway is obviously in the European Free Trade Agreement. It's one of 3 countries. So actually it can set higher environmental legislation. So it can develop more ambitious environmental legislation. But actually, interestingly, Norway hasn't transposed some key pieces of environmental legislation into their kind of national government's legislation. So these are the Birds Directive and the Habitats Directive, which are ones that I think Pete mentioned were often particularly troublesome in intertidal and marine environments. So so Norway generally, from a planning point of view, has very similar planning position. It's kind of national government policies, but working with local governments. So very similar to the UK or to England at least, but actually probably slightly strangely, maybe weaker environmental legislation. I suppose the difference is that demographics and country specifics for Norway are different. It's much more sparsely populated, but equally, a lot of that population is based upon around the fjords and in the low-lying areas. So different issues at play, possibly less pressure on land in Norway, maybe more pressure on our land, but probably more regulated. And I think just picking up, Sue, one of the other questions, I can kind of maybe start off on an answer of that and then pass over to others. But as a side to what I've just mentioned, David Mundy's point about what's the most important single step the government could or should take to help facilitate waterside development. I think leading on the back of that comment I just made, I think is actually getting the regulators to work together. So we've talked about the Coastal Concordat, and that has had, in my opinion, mixed responses from the various regulators in terms of whether or not they actually agree to it and who actually wants to take control. And a lot of time is spent squabbling between internal departments to try and decide on the approach. So and each scheme seems to be different and a different approach, which sometimes makes sense. But so I'll kick it off on that one and pass back. But hopefully that's answered both those 2 questions.
Thank you very much, Gavin. I wondered, Chris, if you had a view on what David has asked. He's asked what's the most important single step government could or should take to help facilitate waterside development.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. I think there's a recognition that by definition, some of the challenges that particularly coastal towns and communities have faced, I think the government is minded to recognise that deficit really in its funding for infrastructure projects. And I think if they continue to realise their ambitions and the rhetoric at the moment in terms of a shared prosperity fund, then I think understanding the viability challenges of the infrastructure needs of some of the projects we've heard about this morning through government investment, I think would be a really important step to take.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. There is another question from Ian Dobson of Burn Lobby. He's asked, there's a statement, waterfront developments, both landside and waterside, are sometimes guilty of chasing the high value penthouse super yacht market rather than providing real community use. I wonder if one of our speakers would like to comment on that. Perhaps Pete, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I'm very happy to. I think there's some truth in that, and one of the things I didn't say about the Nozzle Duct site was that one of the things that attracted us to it was that there was a minded to consent position reached by the previous owner of the site prior to us acquiring it, and that was very much a residential-led scheme. It was, and this is a personal opinion, but it was a scheme that had a marina and a small boatyard area to try and justify what was a very, very substantial residential development. I think we took a different view with Nozzle Duct, and we have a substantial boatyard which will generate significant local employment. There are, I think, about 18 commercial units that we're constructing alongside the boatyard, and we also have a sort of, we had as part of our placemaking for the site, we were thinking about a live, work, learn and play thing. So we also have a relationship with Southampton College, which does a lot of marine specific training, and we have actually built a property specifically for them, so that will become part of the reason for being for the site. But I do you know, we're marina operators and we're very interested in the marinas, we're very interested in the boatyards. They do operate as mini ecosystems, and I think there are sites out there that become too residential led. Equally, there are sites out there that look just to do the super yachts, and in reality, there aren't that many of those. So, and I don't know how many of them come to the south coast of the UK in any event. So, I think by default, if you're building a marina in the UK, it needs to take into account a broad range of uses if it's going to work.
Great, thanks very much, Pete. There's just a supplementary question for you, Pete, from Neil Jacobson of the Crown Estate. He asks if the Premier development at Nos Mayo, was there any prospect of applying for descheduling the World War II launching structures? Was that ever an option?
It wasn't suggested as an option by my consultant team, I have to say. And it's an interesting one, that, because they are only visible for a short period of time, but we certainly never went down that route. And in fact, we've ended up, the construction of our marina does provide some protection for them, and we've got some information boards that will be going up just to show people what they are and explain what they are. So it added time probably and a little bit of cost.
Thanks, Pete. Sorry, Katy, I think you had a question for Matt and David.
I did, Sue. Unfortunately, they send their apologies. They've just had to jump off this call
Okay.
to something else. So I wonder whether we might put any of the questions back towards Pete, Gavin, or Chris.
Yeah, sure. There is another question from Bernard Sims, and he asks if the panel think that the growth in the leisure boating industry will be adversely affected by taxation issues with red diesel use and the drive to more environmentally friendly power units. I guess, Pete, you might want to start off on that one.
I don't think we've had growth since 2008, so I look forward to having that problem. I think there are. So we've struggled with declining growth actually since 2008. Ironically, post-COVID, we've had a little bit of a bump and a bounce, and there is more interest in people doing things that are closer to home. We've seen the same thing with golf courses. I think environmental is getting more, is going to become more and more important, and the economy of boats. I think boat disposal is also a big issue now, what you do with boats when they get to the end of their lives, because that is not as straightforward as it might sound. I think there are all kinds of other environmental factors that need to be considered. You know, how clean are your boatyards, how well you manage your fuel bays, what you do with black water waste, and how marinas manage all of that. And you need to cater for all of those. Equally, how good is your fuel that you're providing? How clean is that? How lean does that burn? Do we need to start providing for carbon offset, or give people the option to offset their carbon footprint when they are buying fuel for their marine engines? So I think it's definitely the case that our audience, or our customer base, is very interested in environmental matters and their environmental footprint, particularly as it affects the sea. So I think as a commercial organisation, the onus is on us to make sure that we address that, and we do something about that going forward. On the taxation point, I think that's going to be a factor for everybody. It's going to affect us as much as any other leisure business.
Thank you very much, Pete. I think, John, you had a question for Chris.
I did indeed. Chris, obviously the island marine offer is an important component in its economy. How do you think that the island can punch its weight in the Solent area when it's trying to attract investment, both government and private?
Thanks, John. I think it's the collaboration is the word, isn't it? whilst there are no formal structures on a regional level in the Solent, clearly the Solent Lab plays a really important role in bringing a strategic vision for the region together. And what we attempt to do is obviously to align our proposals with that vision for the Solent and the maritime sector more generally. I think it's going to come to a focus around the development of the application for free port status for Southampton. And I think, you know, we provide both the land side and obviously the marine component to potentially not punch our weight, but at least make a significant contribution to that Southampton proposition.
Thank you very much, Chris. I don't see any other questions from our audience. So I'll take this as the final question for Gavin, if I may. Gavin, what do you see as the main hurdles in putting together a master plan for a regeneration project on of the scale? Sorry, Chris is laughing.
How long have you got?
Well, on the scale of the projects you've talked about today,
Yeah.
I know it's a very open-ended question, but perhaps if you could succinctly answer it, that would be great.
I'll try.
Thank you.
I think it starts off with a really clear understanding of the site and the opportunities, the constraints. So looking at everything, and one of the ways that we do this is we look at it as it's almost a disc where you put all the various elements kind of on that disc, and you kind of highlight, are they actually pulling in the direction of the scheme of the project? So are they going to assist development? Are they going to bring value in, or are they actually going to be a constraint that we need to work with? And then looking at how strong those are and how important those are. So making sure you do a full kind of review of the site early on, with as much information as you can have from historic data, historic surveys, et cetera, because there are some things that you will be able to override. There are some things that you need to work with. Communication with all parties, so communication with kind of all the statutory and non-statutory consultees, local community, really bringing everyone with you through the project, but understanding the brief and understanding the rationale for it. So having that very clearly set out at the start. And I think kind of picking up probably on, so that's the two issues. One is kind of understanding the context, the issues, the constraints, the opportunities, understanding the brief and working with the whole community and engagement, all parties. And then probably the final bit is something that kind of Chris really kind of touched on, which is absolutely vital, is the economics and potentially support, infrastructure support, and potentially safeguarding. So some of the work that we're doing at Tipna and previously did on the Isle of Wight at East Cowes was very much about making sure that land that has deep water access or potential for deep water access is used for users that require that access to the waterfront. And so, there's no point putting housing on the side of these Cowes Red Funnel Ferry and finding that there's nowhere for the Red Funnel Ferry to berth, and you don't have any access to the Isle of Wight. So you're kind of chopping off your nose to spite yourself. But the trouble is that waterfront development can lead to higher values. So quite often, even with kind of industrial sheds, actually an industrial boat building shed will probably not attract any higher revenue than a kind of industrial shed on the open market. But the trouble is that industrial boat building sheds need a lot of infrastructure beside them. So hoists and boat building facilities and kind of opportunities to take boats out of the water and everything else. So therefore, it's easier for a private developer just to come in and say, we're just going to build an industrial shed and sell it to the open market. So really that's where the likes of public bodies, the councils, government needs to kind of step in, either allocating things in local plans, or actually kind of seeking government support from the LEP to make sure that the proper use is being made of those rare sites that do still have deep water access, and there aren't that many on the Solent anymore. So really those three issues: so understanding the context, engagement, and finance.
Great. Thanks, Gavin. That was a very concise answer to a very big question. I don't know, Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
Only just a comment. That's why Gavin and his colleagues get paid so well, to come up with those types of answers. So you clearly at the top end of the spectrum there, and it's really the communications issue that Gavin hits on there, and the stakeholder management of that is really first class and is required to achieve a successful outcome.
Great, thank you so much indeed. So I'd just like to thank everyone for attending today, and also our speakers, and I hope that you all take away some helpful insights into issues which may be relevant to your own businesses. If you want to contact any of us at BDB Pitmans, our contact details are on the slide, which you can see at the moment. It'll be there for a couple of minutes. I would just like to do a plug for a future webinar, which we're involved in. We're sponsoring as a firm and chairing a session at the virtual South Coast Development Conference on the 20th of January in conjunction with Built Environment Networking. The session relates to placemaking and major development projects. It's going to examine the biggest challenges and major opportunities across the South Coast, with a focus on driving investment, zero carbon development and regeneration, also making and creating destinations across the region. Anyone who attended today will receive details from us in due course on how to join that conference. So sadly, we've come to the end of our session. Thank you all for attending. I'll say goodbye for now. Thank you very much. Goodbye.